Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Diverse Voices, where we are sharing leadership stories with our viewers. Hi, LinkedIn. Hi, YouTube. So great to see you. We have a special guest on today, Bryson Rose. Hi, Bryson.
Hey, how's it going?
Very well, very well. A happy Wednesday to you. I want to let everyone know that Bryson Rose is a trainer and activist currently serving as the director of the Center of LGBTQ Youth Advocacy and Capacity Building at the Hetrick-Martin Institute. Bryson has spent 5 years in the role collaborating with government agencies, educational institutions, NGOs to build capacity around supporting the needs of LGBTQ identified youth. And for those of you who are on, please note that we are obviously supporting HMI during Pride and looking for donations to HMI. So for the month of June, Saterman Connect will match donations to HMI up to $2,500. Please go to hmi.org and under the tribute gift, type Diverse Voices. You know, why not do a little fundraising while we're here? Isn't that right, Bryson?
Right, exactly. It's June. It's time for folks to match their support verbally with commitments to supporting some young people who really deserve it and will be very meaningful in their journey forward as they move towards young adulthood.
Definitely. You know, these Heritage Months are really wonderful. It becomes an opportunity for us to spotlight moments of diversity, but it's really important that these intentions that show up at certain times of the year actually show up all during the year within every effort. It's so important.
Yes, we celebrate being LGBTQIA plus all year round. We're just a little extra in June to the ancestors and transcestors that we want to lift up. So absolutely.
So true. I've heard people talk about the alphabet soup of LGBTQIA, and it's just, I still stumble over it as we expand who we are and how we define ourselves and how we see ourselves.
And the thing I love about it most is that young people, so a lot of folks frame this as like being a new concept, like the idea of being non-binary is new or moving past these gender binaries. And actually it's a return to the way that many indigenous communities understood gender and sexuality to exist on continuums, right? Mm-hmm. So I love that Gen Z is actually going back and reclaiming not only the sort of ideas that gender and sexuality are beyond the binary, but also the cultural traditions of these indigenous groups, like Two-Spirit folks, who are the Hijra in India or the Mushe in Mexico, and really challenging the assumption that this is even new, right? This is actually a reflection of people reversing the impacts of colonization and imperialism and reclaiming these identities that are so sacred to many of us. So I love it. I love the return to the alphabet as we know it.
It's so wonderful. Yeah. Homogenization has been a little bit of an issue. Reclaiming your identity and who you are and wearing it in a pin and wearing it proudly is so very important. I think there's going to be plenty of engaging conversation as we go forward. I don't think a lot of our viewers truly understand Hetrick-Martin Institute and perhaps how you see not only yourselves, but how you encourage others to be advocates for LGBTQ plus young people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we are the premier sort of LGBTQIA plus youth serving agency. Our 40 years or 40 plus years of experience tells us that the systems that exist outside of our space are not set up so that our young people can thrive, right? So they're encountering racism, they're encountering homophobia and trans antagonism, they're subject to laws and policies that don't take into account how poverty impacts their lives. And so what HMI's real goal is to shift, right, how those things show up in our space. So we're committed to being anti-racist. We're committed to sort of not pathologizing young people around mental health. We are committed to sort of affirming and celebrating the many different ways that people can have a body in terms of ability, in terms of orientation, in terms of gender, and creating programs around that allow young people to flourish, right? So our young people are at promise, they're not at risk. So They come to us with a whole bunch of potential that's untapped because these systems don't see them as worthy. And all that we do is sort of break down those systems and say, what is it that you want to do? How do you want to thrive? How do you want to be successful? And that's what we do. It's really not magic. It's intention. It's resilience and determination. But it's also recognizing that people interact with systems, right? Like, our young people are not experiencing homelessness because they are gay or lesbian or trans or non-binary. They're experiencing homelessness because of the conflation of lots of systemic oppression, right? So being kicked out of your home because you identify as LGBTQIA+, or experiencing harm within these systems like ACS or within other sort of shelters or transitional living facilities, or experiencing harassment, both verbal and physical, in our schools. That's what makes our young people's lives harder, not their beautiful selves. And all HMI recognizes that we need to remove those systems in order to let young people thrive.
Oh my gosh, I love that. It reminds me of when I was a young person. Not that I was out back in the day, but I was whoever I was. And bullying, you're right, it's systematic. The fact that adults allow for that to exist in any form, it's just manifesting for some of our young people in their instance, but that bullying is ever present.
It's ever present. It often goes unchecked, right? It becomes something that people see as normative. And so what I think is really interesting is also you bring up something around not being out, or really what happens in systems like, let's say, heterosexism and homophobia and transphobia. People are actually policed, right? So before folks even disclose, have a sense of self, they are policed around things like gender. So before I knew that I would be attracted to men, right? There was a perception of that because of how I express my gender, how I use my hands to talk, or the tone and sort of tenor of my voice, the cadence of my speech, the activities I was invested in, on top of being fat, right? Like, these are things that the current system says there's a certain way to have a body, and anyone who doesn't have that body exists below the sort of ideal. And so our young people experience that far before they even come out. And then once folks begin to sort of disclose or identify, then the bullying, the harassment, the violence is even escalated.
Yeah, but such a sad but excellent point to bring up, that there are norms that people express, but truly what is normal, it's a kind of like the middle ground perhaps of all this wonderful spectrum of lived experiences. So I think there's a lot that we can talk to, and I think there's a lot of awareness that happens not only during Pride, but during so many other parts of the year.
Exactly.
I think that there's opportunity to talk a little bit more specifically about advocacy and capacity building. I know that's really your primary role. You speak so eloquently around the idea of it, but what does advocacy and capacity building mean, not only in your job, but the way you see it?
Yeah, so I think capacity building is bringing in subject matter experts who can talk about larger concepts and help break things down that are really complex, right? So that folks can have an understanding. Most people do not have a real thorough understanding of gender and sexual orientation, right? Like, they often conflate the two. They don't understand the intersections of those things. And so people make a lot of assumptions, right? That the current context or that their context is the context, and that's actually not true, right? So we know gender has shifted over time. So in the early part of the 20th century, if you or I were born and assigned male at birth, we would have been swaddled in pink because pink initially was a boy color, right? Versus someone who's assigned female at birth, blue was considered a girl color. That's now switched because we know gender is actually a construct, right? So all the ways that we think about gender norms were constructed, and they've looked different at different parts of time. They're also informed by things like race. So we can never talk about gender without talking specifically about how race plays a role in the construction of gender, particularly thinking about who could be considered a man or a woman, particularly in this country. So you need folks that are able to talk about that and then talk about sexual orientation and the iterations and the different contexts around the different world, the different sort of constellations and ideas around it, to really get people to go, actually, I don't know. And I should spend a little bit more time thinking about this because I just believe what I've been told, right? And it could change. It literally could change tomorrow because it has. And then advocacy is saying, because we know what we know, what do we need to change so that more people can live a life standing fully in their dignity and in their power, right? Like, what does it mean for a young person to be able to self-determine their sense of self without the fear of violence, without the fear of harm, without the fear of being ostracized? What does that look like? And so it can happen in the terms of laws, in terms of policy. It can happen in terms of community building, right? Shifting, bringing coalitions together, right? And it's intersectional. So it's like our young people at HMI, plus to the young people that attend HMI, have many different aspects of their identities, right? And so some of the ways that we advocate for them are connected to their citizenship status and their sense of gender identity, right? Related to their race and their sense of sexual orientation, related to the ways they experience being able to participate in formal economies or not based upon other parts of their identities, like living in poverty. So all of those things are really important. So the capacity building is first to heighten that awareness, give folks some tools and some skills and some frameworks and some analysis. And then the advocacy is to say, now that we know what we know, what can we shift or move or transform or get rid of that we know will actually build up people's ability to support LGBTQ youth?
Well, and those elements have been built over centuries. So it's not going to take a day or a moment or a workshop to just break it down.
Right.
To your point, it takes a lot of that capacity building, and advocacy is ever present and a true opportunity from a standpoint of education.
And we say it's a lifelong learning experience, right? So you're not going to leave the workshop never using the raw gender pronouns for someone. But what you will leave with is the awareness that, oh, wait, I need to shift the way that I see people in the world so that I'm not making assumptions about gender, so that I'm not using the wrong gender pronouns. That's right. What we hope to leave with.
That's so wonderful. You know, something you bring up talks to the idea of the way people are seen. And I wonder if we could just dig in a little bit about a bit of language, because I know we talked about that earlier, but when it comes to language, what can we talk about around the differences of equality and equity?
That's a great question. So many people, lexicons around social justice are at an all-time high. Folks have lots of access to social media, and so folks are using language in the ways that they think make sense. And again, we hold definitions with an open palm rather than a closed fist. What equity means to me may be something a little different to someone else. And it's important that words mean things. So equality is the idea that we all have the same access to resources, experiences. We're all socialized and seen in the same ways, that we all experience safety or danger in the same ways, that we have very much similar lived experiences, so that when we're presented with obstacles or opportunities, that we'll be able to respond in the same ways. Equity recognizes that that is not true, and that probably never will be true, and that people need different tools, resources, support in order to be successful and thrive in a system that really narrowly defines what safety and success looks like. So an example of that would be when young people are moving and traversing through school environments, right? We recognize that young people are coming in with different relationships to language access, right? So there are some folks who come from monolingual, non-English speaking homes, and those that don't, right? And so, though, in terms of equity in the classroom, the ways in which we support students will look different if we want English mastery as a part of the educational experience, right? So there's this unilateral understanding of what we want. There's going to be different tools and resources needed. For LGBTQIA plus young people, that is the idea that there are these gender scripts that exist in society, right? And they look different in different communities. But generally speaking, there are these expectations solely based upon the sex and gender you were assigned at birth that young people may not be interested, desire to achieve or sit in. And it's important that we are creating educational equity, that we are talking about these things, that we're naming these things, that we're normalizing that there's an actual kaleidoscope of different ways to exist within a body around gender and sexuality, so that young people don't feel a sense of inferiority or shame around the ways they show up in the world.
So when you're talking to individuals who equity and equality are like the nuances of that will be entirely lost on them. How do you frame equity and equality in a very approachable way? Like what's the, almost like a punchline? Sorry, I'm coming from a marketing lens, but what's the simple way of understanding that?
I don't know if there is. I think that there is no, in the same ways that that's what implicit biases are, right? They're things that we hear or see over and over that inform our lens, right? So in the same way that implicit biases take repetition over time and that goes unquestioned, this is something that we sort of approach in a way that's like, let's begin to unpack, right? Like there's lots of work that has to go into it. So I don't actually think there's a punchline. I do think an easier way to think about it, and I'm sure many folks have seen this, is thinking about the fence, right? Looking at the baseball game. There's an image of three people of different heights who are trying to look at a baseball game over a fence. And so there's different iterations of it. There's like equality, which is like everyone gets the same ladder, right? Where the shortest person is still not able to see, but they all got equal things, right? Then there's equity, where people get different types of ladders so that everyone can see. And then there's sort of like abolition, or sort of like liberation, where the fence is gone, right? So the fence is actually the thing that doesn't allow folks to see the game to begin with, right? Like regardless of the height, you can see the fence. You can see the game if the fence wasn't there. That's a really good explanation of like what that looks like. But I think it has to go deeper, because people need to make it relevant to their own lived experiences and the work that they do, right? So folks could say, the best person for the job is going to get the job. Well, best is relative, right? What is your concept of best, right? Like, what are your sort of, what are the ways that you've been socialized and acculturated to see best? A perfect example would be the ways in which people talk, right? So this idea of like, there's been this whole thing about how there are feminine presenting folks, or women, or femmes, not having upspeak at the end of their talk. So it's like, talk like this so that people take you seriously. When it's like, actually, we need to be talking about sexism. People have different ways of talking, and so we should be listening to people, right? That's an equity lens, right? Like it's different approaches, but it could be the same thing. So rather than asking people to conform and comport themselves in a particular way, why don't we say, there are many ways to get to this point. Why don't we honor all of those things?
Yeah, I think that speaking to those lived experiences and the complexities around getting to a point of moving forward, understanding that the communication itself, how are you just listening and hearing the words, not, understanding even the content or the intent, is extremely important. I think for those of you who are just joining us, it's important to understand we're looking at this holistically of being an advocate for LGBTQ young people. That's we're joined today by Bryson Rose. Bryson, as we're talking a little bit about equality and equity, I think about leadership and the opportunity for leading. So what can leaders learn from the experiences of those traversing these spaces and the experts themselves? Because I know sometimes the person who is maybe, let's just say, a little outside of the norm is the one who's expected to speak of their issues and tell their stories. And they may not be equipped to do that or comfortable to do that. And that's where there's an opportunity for experts themselves. So what can leaders learn from the experiences of those both traversing the spaces and the experts?
That's a great question. And I also want to say paid to do that, right? Someone could be working for you and they're doing their job and they're doing things for you that are not being paid for, on top of experiencing some of the difficulties navigating and traversing these spaces. I think the first thing is leaders need to recognize that it's endemic and systemic. So it's not unique to this one person, right? Like there's so much out there, right? If you're a leader, I'm making assumptions about your capabilities to research and to discern and to figure things out and to understand nuance. So at this point, right, it's a part of the cultural zeitgeist. We know that different groups of people experience work environments, experience political environments differently based upon their group memberships. Mm-hmm. So I have to make that assumption, right? Because I think that otherwise, I don't know what planet you are living on as a leader. So first of all, it's recognizing that there's stuff already out there that you can just familiarize yourself with, right? Lean into discomfort, lean into the idea that you don't know all the things. I think secondly is to listen to experts, right? Like there are folks that do this for a living that you can pay, that spend time learning, unlearning, adding nuance, building, adding to the canon, adding to the research, that are important to making these things happen. And then having and building the environment where people are able to give honest feedback in a way where people don't feel like they'll be threatened or it's hostile. Part of it is that if diversity, solving complex problems calls for diversity of thought and lived experiences and perceptions and race and gender and educational experience and geographic location and languages spoken, all those things matter. And so as the world gets more complex, right, we need a complexity of thought as informed by lived experiences. And so it's just important to know that that's where we're moving. That's just where we're shifting. And so I think the first thing is to acknowledge that there are folks that know more about this than you, and so you should be employing them. Secondly, you want to think about what type of environment do you have, right? Like, where folks can feel to give feedback and honest feedback. And then I think, lastly, it really is about leaning in and hearing those folks when they're telling you things that can look different, because you ultimately want to get to that end solution, which is solving some of the world's most complex problems.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for sharing that perspective. I think about experts, and when you talk about people who are paid to manage these conversations, there's a lot of individuals who may share their stories, and one reason that there may not be a sense of belonging is because people don't feel comfortable being themselves. And when you have an expert in the room, maybe moderating the conversation when those who speak up are pushing back on the conversation, those facilitators are equipped to broach that dialogue in a comfortable space in a room. There's also obviously opportunities for where human resources can speak up and tap in. So you're right, there's a lot that those leaders can do to acknowledge the learning journey everyone is on, but also the learning journey those experts are on, that they can provide a lot of information and guideposts along the way.
And sometimes we learn a lot from silence. So if you're in a room and you're talking and folks aren't saying anything, that's also indicative. So I also want to be mindful that folks may not even feel comfortable saying something, or it's not a safe space for them to do such a thing. And so that silence also can teach us a lot around what type of environment we're in.
Sure. Well, and speaking of silence, we're seeing a couple of chats coming through and some comments. If there are any particular questions individuals have, please feel free. We have a couple of points about conversations early on, your points of ancestors. I think that resonated with some of our audience members, and just being generous with your thoughts and your conversation is really appreciated. If there are any additional questions that come through, of course, everyone, we're happy to share those and see Bryson's take on some of your smart questions. I think there's something we can revisit around systems in and of themselves, where, I'm often curious, what can leaders learn about the systems to help change those systems?
Well, that's a really good question. I think they need to understand that we live and operate under systems, right? So oftentimes people will try to reduce conflict to interpersonal disagreement or sort of like a personal thing, rather than thinking about what are the contexts or the systems that sort of govern this space where we can shift, right? So I think people need to understand that we operate within systems. Like, that's how we operate as a country. It just is. Travel, work, how we get paid, taxing, like all of it is a system. And that we want more folks to lean in and chime in to shape those systems so that they're the most equitable. And it's incumbent upon leaders to think about the systems that they have that can be malleable, that can shift. Like, there may be something you just didn't consider because it's not your experience. It's not a place of judgment. It's a place of learning. Where I want more leaders to lean into is their humility, right? Like, part of the reason why you hire such great talent is because you're great and you're supposed to want great people around you. And so ultimately, your goal is to empower people to do their jobs really well and to perhaps be, the person's able to see a blind spot that you're not able to see. That's why they're on your team. That's why they're part of your workspace and your workflow. So I think it's important for folks to understand that we operate within systems, and that when you're a leader, you are leading within a system. And so it's important for all of your actions and your thoughts to speak to that system, right? That's what I think is really important for folks. And change, again, may come and look. You may need to rely on folks who are experts to help you change, help you think through some of those changes.
Yeah, there's a lot to the systems themselves that I think people take for granted. They think it's a zero-sum game. If someone's getting something, then someone's not getting something else. And it can be often a loss of the not only the human quality of life, but productivity. When people are included in the conversation, they're able to achieve so much more and contribute more, whether we acknowledge that or not. So there's opportunity, I think, for all of us to look at these systems and figure out how we can refine them to invite more people to the table. Although maybe if I follow your fence analogy, should there be a table? But I'm not sure.
Should there be multiple tables, right? Should there be, I even think about small things that we can do, right, around how systems work. So we live in a world where folks who are male identified or masculine presenting or demonstrate communication in a very masculine type of way are privileged, right? They're seen as smarter, more capable, more apt to lead. And so I did some work. One of my professors talked about a strategy that a company used, a bank, was that all of the ideas were solicited prior to the meeting and they were posted. So the idea solicitation wasn't verbal. It was all sort of written, and they were posted up and no one's names were attached to the ideas. And folks got to vote on the ideas, right? So if there were 3 that were the same, right, they were sort of grouped into one sort of bucket, and then folks would vote. And in terms of gender, in terms of race, like, that played a huge role in people's sort of ideas, being bubbled up to the top. Versus how it was happening before. So it could be really small things like that, or thinking about, when we reward folks for getting more degrees in the organization, what's the sort of underlying thing around that? Like, who has access to get degrees, who can finance them? What does it really mean, right? Like, how do we talk about those things that were a really good thing? We want to reward you for getting more education, which we think will help the business. But in terms of being able to matriculate through a program or finance a program, that may not be the same for everyone in the company. So
That's such a great point. And even if an organization encourages the education itself, or even are willing to finance the education, there's the additional issue of what's that person's home life like? Do they have the time to take this class? I think this is fantastic. I love the work that Hetrick-Martin Institute is doing. Bryson, I want to maybe go through a little bit of a quick round. I have a couple questions that I think might be interesting, but also want to remind everyone who's watching, as we're talking about how to be an advocate for LGBTQ young people, that we are, of course, looking to raise money for Hetrick-Martin as well. Please go to hmi.org. Saterman Connect for the month of June will match donations up to $2,500. When you mention in the tribute gift Diverse Voices, we'll match those dollars for dollar, and are happy to support all of Bryson and his team's hard work. So, Bryson, I was really just trying to think about, you talk about this being a learning journey, but sometimes there's always an opportunity for a quick win when we're tackling these bigger issues. Maybe there's one impactful tip or action our audience can take today to make themselves a better ally.
I think pronouns are really important.
I froze. Sorry.
I'm here. I think pronouns are really important. So I think sharing pronouns, asking for pronouns is something that folks should walk away with and do some investigation on. I think when you think differently about how you see people, it lends itself to other ways that you make assumptions about people, right? So if you stop gendering people in the world and you say, you know, that person with the beautiful red scarf, or my friend with the HMI shirt on, rather than, hey, guy, or that man, that's a journey for you to begin to think differently about how we see people, how we see ourselves.
Oh yeah, pronouns are so empowering. When you introduce yourself to someone else, it just sort of sets the stage of how you want to be greeted and how you wish to be engaged. It is truly a great approach that some of us have adopted in our day-to-day activities. Is there a way in which we can, obviously that can extend in our personal life and in our professional life, but maybe if we're looking at our business environment, do you have a piece of professional advice for our audience, something that they can consider? It could be the same thing, obviously, but
I think it has to start small. And I think, I think pronouns, I think allowing people to self-determine identity is a huge thing in the world. So I would say that's something that's all around business, personal, in the street, just being mindful of how we see others, how we create space for people to tell us who they are, how we honor people's names and pronouns is a way to humanize people. And I think that when you see people for their full selves, you're more likely to engage in conversations to make things easier for everyone, or create more inclusivity.
Yeah, I think that seeing people for their full selves and understanding that if you misstep or misspeak, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, and just move on, right? Like, it's just a situation. We're human, words are complex, and sometimes we're not fully present in our conversation and we stumble. But with the, granting others grace can get you so much. I am wondering, as we close out, I don't have a magic wand, but sometimes that can help, envisioning that you have one. If you could solve one problem, what would it be?
It would probably be the funding challenges that communities have. So I would shift lots of funding that goes to things that are punitive and carceral, and I would empower community leaders and organizations with lots of money to do the things that they know would really transform their lives and their communities. So I'm all about budget justice and making sure that our communities get the money that they deserve to do the work that we know will heal and transform communities.
That's so great. I mean, there are different ways we can spend our funding and accomplish so much more. I mean, Bryson, you've been amazing. Thank you for bringing your thoughtfulness and your experience, your expertise to bear for our audience. I want to again encourage everyone to recognize that we are raising money for Hetrick-Martin Institute. If you go to hmi.org and donate money for the month of June, Sederman Connect will match up to $2,500. And Bryson, I know it's Pride Month. I know there's a lot of celebrating and acknowledgement going on there. I hope that there is only growth from here for you and Hetrick-Martin Institute. And I want to thank you for just such a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride. All right. Be well. Bye, everyone.
Take care.